to Ask the Patient Advocate podcast, where we will discuss all things related to navigating your health. I am Dr. Elena Borrelli, and I'm so excited to talk about such an important topic of private patient advocacy. Managing your health and navigating the healthcare system is challenging, but it's a lot better when we go through it together. Welcome back to a new episode of Ask the Patient Advocate podcast. Today's guest truly embodies the power of patient advocacy and community. We're joined by Ben Munoz, a stroke survivor, entrepreneur, angel investor, and founder of Ben's Friends, one of the largest online networks of patient support communities of rare diseases. Ben's story begins with his own rare medical emergency, an AVM-related stroke, and a moment many of our listeners will relate to, leaving the hospital alive, but feeling lost, alone, and unsure of what comes next. Ben, we're so honored to have you today. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I have so many questions, and I'm so excited to hear more about your journey. So maybe let's start at the beginning. You survived a rare AVM-related stroke in 2006, and many people don't even know what that is, unless you work in healthcare, but it's still quite rare. And, can you share what that experience was like? Maybe a little bit of what exactly that is, and especially like once you left the hospital, what was that like? And I know that's a lot of loaded questions, so share as you feel comfortable.
Yeah, of course. So at the time, I was a 29-year-old MBA student, and I was in Dallas visiting a friend, and we were just having dinner, and I felt nausea and a headache. And so I thought, maybe I'm having some kind of food poisoning. So I was like, okay, this is weird, but it felt very different. So I rushed myself to the hospital. And the symptoms were vomiting and nausea. I rushed myself to the hospital. Luckily, the hospital was only maybe 5 minutes away, and I went to the ER. And in the ER, I stood at the back of the line, and so I didn't know what was going on, but I was at the back of the line, and I called a friend of mine who was a physician in Boston at the time, and he was actually doing residency. So I was very lucky to get a hold of him. So I called him and I said, "Hey, Kevin, I'm experiencing these symptoms. I'm vomiting, nausea. I've got this pain, dull pain in the back of my head, and I can't turn my head left or right." And so he diagnosed me immediately. He goes, "You know what? That sounds really serious. Sounds like maybe a possible brain hemorrhage. Do not stand in the back of the line. You will die. Go to the front of the line, tell the triage nurse that you're talking to me, give her the phone." And that's exactly what I did. So I gave the nurse the phone. He explained, and then they rushed me back to the back for immediate observation. And there I had emergency brain surgery within 30 minutes. And so
Oh my
afterwards, they
gosh.
explained to me what happened. They said, like, look, you've just had a brain hemorrhage caused by, we don't know yet, but often these are a rare form of brain hemorrhage for somebody at your age, 29 years old. We'll explain later. So things settled down. They explained to me that I was diagnosed with an arteriovenous malformation, and it was still there, and so they'd have to operate again after I recovered from my initial surgery. So then became all right. I guess I'm an AVM patient, and I went home, recovered, and I had to figure out what's next. So at the time, this was 2006. So this was before social media, before Facebook, before any of
Yes, you
that,
got to read
and
books
so
and go to the library and stuff, right?
yeah. So I called around friends who are doctors and asked for opinions, asked for advice, and it was very confusing. Eventually, I got enough information together where I decided on a treatment plan for myself. And then it was spent a year and a half waiting. Actually, I got the treatment, which was not surgery, it was radiation. And then followed was another maybe a year and a half or 2 years with this ticking time bomb in my head that could explode at any time
Oh,
unless it was fully healed. So that those 2 years were ended up being pretty isolating and like very anxiety stricken, as you can imagine. And so I have a background in software. So what I did is I went on the line and tried to find out any communities, any support groups. I couldn't really find anything. All I could find was a mailing list. And so I created my own website. That website was called avmsurvivors.org. And then I started just kind of spreading the word. I went to like any email lists, starting old school message boards, and tried to let everybody know that if you've ever had an AVM or if you have one now, come join us in this group. And so it took off. So that one group turned into, and I think the first month there were like 10 people, then 50 people, then 100 people, then 1,000 people, and it took on a life of its own. And then a friend saw what I was doing and said, "This is amazing. Like, you're impacting so many people, giving them support and helping them support each other. Why don't you maybe do this for other rare diseases?" And so I said, "Sure, that sounds like a worthy use of time." So I started other websites for other rare diseases, and then before you know it, we had dozens of these websites, and then we formalized it under a nonprofit, official 501(c)(3) nonprofit called bensfriends.org.
I love that. That is amazing. I mean, you took a terrible, unexpected, traumatic experience and turned it into something so useful for so many people. And it's very easy when you have these rare, sudden, unpredictable experiences to feel very isolated. And I'm sure that was a lot of, or something that you felt as well. So how did you, like, thinking back, how did you kind of decide to make a difference and kind of get over that isolation and say, I know you mentioned you want to find like information out there and see what's available, but how did what kind of motivated you to keep going and to go in the positive direction?
I don't know. I guess it's just my personality.
Good.
I think it's just, well, first of all, gratitude. That was the biggest thing. Is I could have died. I probably should
Mhm.
have died, but I did not. So therefore, I have an opportunity. What am I going to do with it? Am I just going to go on my business and like live, or am I going to try to give back? And so I decided, you know what? I'm really thankful for this opportunity and second chance at life. Let me use my skills and abilities as an entrepreneur, a software engineer, to help others in need, and then that's what led to me creating like something bigger than otherwise if I just sat back on the couch and went on with my life.
I love that. I really do. It's amazing that you made that, and I'm sure there's so many people that are thankful and that you've benefited by sharing that information and creating those platforms. You often say, I learned, community is the best medicine. So why do you feel, and I definitely agree with you, by the way, but why do you feel that peer support is so critical, especially for people with rare conditions or in atypical situations?
Yeah, everybody. So especially because of our medical system.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I guess the physiological issues are everyone pays attention to the physiological issues because there's a whole system set up for that. So there's doctors. Unfortunately, because of how our system is set up, the doctors don't really have enough time as they would like to
Agreed.
really dive deep and
Hmm.
to understand some of the details of what's going on. It's just they're just too overwhelmed, and the kind of the pay structures are not set up for them to go above and beyond in traditional hospitals and traditional clinics. They just can't. So what do? Well, we have to support each other. So that's when we became like this whole movement of patient advocacy that is peer to peer. And so
I love
we
that.
that's what we focus on. Is that is not obviously not a direct replacement, but it can be very helpful in terms of redirecting people towards maybe therapies that they didn't think or they weren't told were options for them. Just because a doctor doesn't have enough time a lot of times to dive into the details, like someone else who's been through what you've been through and probably knows at least as much as a typical family physician might know about this particular disease. They're very well read because they've lived it, and they may not know everything about medicine, but about this particular disease, there a lot of them can be experts and can be incredibly useful once you find them out there on trusted communities.
No, I absolutely agree. Years before, there was this kind of common notion that, like, you're not supposed to ask questions at the hospital or at doctor's appointments because it's almost like you don't want to offend the provider. It was sort of just like patients were scared to ask questions. And I think nowadays I still see that, but I always encourage, ask the questions. This is your life. Like, it's so important to bring information that you think maybe might be helpful, because maybe it wasn't considered or they're not familiar with it. I mean, the technology and the internet and remote practicing and things like that have allowed for so much more shared information, increased education, increased ability to manage things, and so forth. So that should be utilized to our benefit. So I always encourage patients to ask the questions and, not be afraid to like be part of your care team and not just sit there and listen and, be hesitant to speak up when you need to.
Yeah, actually, I forgot to mention, I also went to medical school. And in medical school, I learned what is taught in the medical schools at top medical school programs like the one that I went to. And as students, even back in 2012, when I started medical school, we used Wikipedia religiously to study for our exams. And so Wikipedia is almost certainly trustworthy. It goes in depth. And so that was back then. Nowadays, it's become even more democratized. So you can go beyond Wikipedia and you can go to AI, and with
Hmm.
high level of confidence that the general information that you will learn from AI, ChatGPT, Claude, and even Gemini, which is now is like the front runner, is
Hmm.
enormous. And so doctors no longer can retain control over this knowledge and information. It's democratized. Anyone can do it. So it's upending and disrupting the healthcare system, and I think that's fantastic.
I couldn't agree more. I think, my next question that I was going to ask you is, some people are concerned that, online platforms provide mismatched or unsafe advice. And I also feel that you can get mismatched advice from healthcare providers, So you do have to take things with a grain of salt. I agree. But I think even getting that advice and bringing it up to like validate it or question it with a experienced provider in that field, it gives you that opportunity to bring it up. Or had you not heard about it in one of those online communities, you would know to even ask about it or question it or look into it. That's my take on that. But what would you say?
There is something to be said for just blindly following what someone on a message board might have said, right? Because that's how rumors spread. And it's just sensational rumors go viral and people don't fact check. But now everything is different. Now it's so easy to fact check anything. So if you hear something on a message board, you can fact check it immediately and hold your doctor accountable. Hey, how come you didn't mention this therapy? There might be some financial incentive for them to go in a different direction, or just they might not even be aware because it's so hard for a doctor to stay on top of all the latest medical advances and on top of probably having a family at home and a busy practice. And it's just yeah, I've seen so many examples uh in my own personal family situation where I was teaching the doctor new things. And luckily doctors, I think, have been become aware of what the new world out there, and it's kind of been like an adjustment from, I don't know, the ones with open-minded who ones are open-minded and don't have an ego really appreciate this. And
Hmm.
so I think it'll just take a little bit of adjustment for doctors to realize that this is a new world. And so, yes, be careful of what you read online, but now you can fact check things.
I absolutely agree with a lot of the points that you said. One is I do like to tell clients, like, if your provider is offended that you're asking them questions or want a second opinion, then that's probably not the provider for you, because that provider should want you to get the best care regardless of who or where you get it from. And, over the years, I've worked in the past in various different health facilities and companies, and they've all been great experiences for one reason or another. But the amount of things that I saw and I learned, it opened my eyes to many things. And, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've brought up during collaboration saying, like, what about this treatment, or, what about this for this patient? And would be told, well, we don't offer that here, so we don't want to recommend it. And that's not really what's best for the patient, because it may not be offered at that facility, so there might be some monetary, pull. But if it's offered and the patient has availability to that, it should be recommended. And that's not always the case, unfortunately. And I think the common practice, patients don't know that kind of goes on behind the scenes. And that unfortunately sometimes very commonly practiced. So
Yeah. And I mean, I also know how medical research takes
Hmm.
time, right? And so it just depends on people's comfort level. So like they, for years, right, we've been influenced by, for example, nutrition, right? For a long
Yes.
time, it was low calorie, low calorie, low calorie, low calorie. And so what that meant is like they're directing things maybe towards like high sugar, high sugar. The industry pushed a certain nutrition kind of program, and that program led us like low fat, low fat, low fat. And so what that
Oh,
meant
sure.
was all the food that we were eating for decades was high in sugar. And so it took a long time for doctors, even doctors have been talking about low fat, for them to start changing what they're telling patients. And so it took time for that research that people knew about for decades to reach the frontline family physician. And so now that's just one example of how that knowledge kind of, it's like it took time for to find its way to family physicians. And so that's the case with a lot of research that goes on now. It just takes time for the research to go from the laboratory to the governing bodies to recommendations to the frontline physician. And so if you want to skip that and be a little more experimental and kind of like question the doctor with what he might have been taught in medical school like decades ago, there's an opportunity, but that's for a small subset of probably your audience that wants to take on that level of like advanced.
Sure. Definitely, there is a personal approach to, the patient's comfort and so forth. I definitely agree with that. So many of our listeners are newly diagnosed or feel incredibly alone right now due to their condition or situation. What's like kind of one thing that you would tell them or you want them to know?
Well, I guess find support. There's so many options out there. Be selective in your support. There are Facebook groups now that often are started by pharmaceutical companies. And so they kind of direct the conversations in a certain way, kind of find out who runs the support group. If it's like a mom, a son with a disease, that's probably a good place. A nonprofit organization that runs a support group, that's a great place. So definitely a support group so that you can kind of immerse yourself. And then also AI. AI is pretty trustworthy, but just make sure that you understand what they're talking about and ask AI to explain things on whatever level that you can understand. If you're, PhD level, like talk to it in that. If you're not, then ask it to explain it on a level that you can understand.
That's great advice. So I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about your work and are curious about how they can connect with you. Where can people find more information about you and the work that you're doing?
I think the best place is our website, bensfriends.org. Email us at info@bensfriends.org. It's about general patient advocacy. They can go to my website, benmunoz.com, and my email, ben@benmunoz.com.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for reminding us that healing isn't just about treatment, it's about connecting, understanding, and being seen. Your work through Ben's Friends and other platforms is really a crucial piece of patient advocacy, and no one should have to navigate illness alone. I say that repeatedly all the time. And so we'll be sure to include your link to Ben's Friends and the patient communities to our show notes. And I really, really appreciate you coming on. I hope that this conversation helps our listeners feel more confident as they navigate their healthcare journey. Thank you so much and have a great day. If you have a question for Ask the Patient Advocate, email advocate@pathwaypa.com. Managing your health and navigating the healthcare system is challenging, but it's a lot better when we go through it together.